Okay, thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Isaac Woodward with the Philos Project. Apologies a little bit for my voice. It's a bit under the weather. Um, but we're looking forward to getting into a discussion about Christians in the Middle East and their experience as a minority. And for that, we have people with both personal expertise and family background in this issue, as well as experience and graduate degrees and work in law also. So I'm very eager to hear more about the life experience and also the work experience of my colleagues here. So I'll get a little bit first into the purpose of the Philos Project for anybody new that's joining us. We're a Christian organization with a focus on the Near East region, and we work to train and equip Christians to understand more deeply this area, which was the cradle of our faith and serves as the origin point for the Abrahamic faiths, and in particular for us as Christians as the place that Christ appeared in human history at a certain time, speaking a certain language to a certain people group. And really, we try to educate and think through what are the legacies of that particular choice that God made, and what does he still have in store for Christians and for Jews that come out of that area and region. So to do this, we do a mixture of education services through online programming, including our Pathfinder courses, which you can check out at our website at philosproject.org. You can go deeper into some of the countries that some of our panelists originate from, like Syria in the case of Hadil. You can learn more about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the origins of it, and how to think through it. You can learn about Christian responses and contributions to anti-Semitism and how we as modern-day believers should work to fight this scourge. And many other topics as well are available there totally free of charge. We also offer in-person retreats for people that go through these courses and then would like to gather with other believers from around the globe to go deeper into these subjects. And then further down the line, for people that stay involved and engaged, we offer trips to the Middle East itself to see some of these places that we learn about and study. And it's been a blessing for me over the last few years to go deeper into these things as someone who was raised a Christian, but in the West, to really understand the people and places that animate the Bible and also what lasting implications it has for my life now. So with that, I'll give brief introductions to each one of our panelists and then turn it over to them for some questions. First, we're joined by Andrew Doran, who's a senior research fellow with the Philos Project. Andrew served on the policy planning staff at the U.S. State Department from 2018 through 21. He previously served as deputy director of the U.S. National Commission for UNESCO at the State Department. He's a co-founder of In Defense of Christians and has published extensively on U.S. foreign policy and human rights in the Middle East. He's an Army veteran and attorney as well. Simone Rizkallah is deputy director of education at the Philos Project. As a first-generation American Egyptian of Armenian descent, 3 hyphenations there. Simone has particular interest in matters of religion, freedom, culture, Eastern roots of our faith. Her graduate degrees in theological studies come from Christendom College, and her undergraduate studies have a professional background in marketing, communications, media, radio, and theater. She's a frequent guest on Catholic Answers and a faculty member of the Avila Institute. You can find her talks, publications, and podcasts on her website, culturalgypsy.com. Our final panelist, Hadil, is a writer and news analyst focusing on U.S. foreign policy for the Middle East. She analyzes foreign policy and foreign affairs for BBC Arabic, Deutsche Welle Arabic, Al Hra, and other major Arabic networks. Hadil was born and raised in Northeast Syria and has advocated for democracy and minority rights in Syria during the years of the war. She's also reported through the outlets like Jamina Voice about the state of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews and has been an active voice calling for a peace process in the Middle East. And I'll turn first to Simone. I've had a chance to get to know Simone for the last few years, and her family background I find endlessly fascinating, in particular for this subject today about Middle Eastern Christians as a minority. Simone, I'd love to hear about your experience straddling 2 minority communities, that of Armenians, which have this long story legacy as the first Christian nation, as well as a massive history in diaspora, both in Israel, which famously has an Armenian quarter in Jerusalem, and then many other countries and cities like Alexandria and Cairo, where your family eventually went to Egypt. So I'd love to hear about your experience with those different identities, what it means to be a minority Christian and some of the legacies of living life in dhimitude in some of these Muslim countries. And I'll briefly just define that term, which we'll use throughout this conversation. A dhimmi comes from the Arabic term going back to the Quran, which refers to the people of the book, which are Jews and Christians, who were permitted since the time of Muhammad to live as minority second-class citizens in Muslim countries. They pay a special jizya tax and have a wide range of restrictions on their conduct, but are supposed to, in theory, be permitted to live and worship with some degree of freedom. So we'll hear about that experience of Christians as dhimmis across several of these countries from our panelists. So with that, Simone, I'd love to hear more about your family background.
Sure, thank you, Isaac, and I'm grateful to be on this panel with Andrew and Hadil. The idea for this panel, I think you mentioned, Isaac, is this article. I think those who are attending this meeting probably have read it or got the invitation to read Andrew's article, Liberated from Dhimitude. So if you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend that you do read it and share it with your network. But yes, there's a lot of hyphens, as you mentioned, Isaac, Egyptian, Armenian, American. So what I find interesting about my family history, who we are Armenians from Egypt. And the reason we ended up in Egypt for the last 100 or so years is because of the Armenian genocide. So, you know, the warning that there would be a massacre of Armenians and the call to leave, and Egypt was a great place to go. So my parents and my grandparents were born in Egypt. And so what I find interesting is that the Armenian language and culture was preserved, even though my parents and my grandparents have never even been to Armenia. But there is such a strong identity with being Armenian because the language and the culture was preserved, and because we were Christians and Armenians in an Islamic country. So while our culture is also Egyptian because we were there for 100 or so years, it's a particularly Egyptian Armenian culture, which is its own thing. So there's the Armenian thing, there's the Egyptian thing, and then there's the unique Egyptian Armenian thing. So coming down to me being born in the United States, also preserving those languages and those cultures, and seeing myself through that background and that lens, even in the United States. So having to grapple with the fact that our family history and these, you could say, I don't like the phrase multicultural, but multicultural because of the having to keep leaving places because of this fact of being a Christian and a Christian minority. And so this problem of also in the West and Christians becoming increasingly here a minority in the West is something that is important to me, because the reason we were in Egypt in the first place is because of Christian persecution. And and so we just keep having to move to different places in order to just be a Christian, whether minority or majority. So that's a little bit about my family background. And that's always in my existential reality, is that even though I'm not dhimmi here in the United States, but that is still the way in which I approach my worldview is shaped by that because of the stories and the history from my parents and my grandparents in Egypt, which I can go into details about what that looks like maybe later.
Yeah, and as a follow-up, I was really curious. So your parents, what years roughly did your grandparents and parents come around the same time, or was it kind of a?
So in the my grandmother was born in Alexandria in 1912.
Wow.
And half of her sisters were born in a Christian region in Turkey, ancient Armenia. And then the rest of them were born in Egypt. So there's like this traveling too. So some of them were born in Turkey, and some of them born in Egypt, and then my parents in Egypt.
Yeah, okay, great. So I was going to ask, I wonder if they've shared it all when they first moved here. What were some of the things they found most surprising, and maybe by contrast? So what are some things that would maybe surprise Western Christians, or we don't think about life and dhimitude, maybe even simple things that we take for granted that you see only when you witness an adult adapting later in life to a second culture and a second place with new freedoms?
Like, what's surprising about the United States, or what would surprise a Westerner about living as a dhimmi or maybe both of
Yeah,
them?
I guess both. You could take it either direction, but I think the one about the US might reveal, things that we take for granted that.
Yeah, I mean, I remember being young, being like 11 years old and it being in Christian circles and thinking, I don't think they're really into their faith here. That's so strange because you can be like a free Christian here. And that's that's 11 years old, me thinking that. And then going to Christian schools here and also having that thought and having that very distinct thought of, wow, what a paradox, or whatever it is, that we could actually go to mass here, go to church here and not really worry about it. But then nobody seems like they want to be there. And my parents actually missing the kind of persecution during, for example, Easter, because it's like there was like a lack of flavor here in the West. Which is strange because we don't want to be persecuted. We don't want to be second-class citizens. We don't want to be dhimmi. But on the other hand, that experience kind of enriches the Christian experience. And so the kind of watered down Christian belonging in the West is like a source of spiritual loss for them till today. I mean, they all talk about that, especially around Easter time. I think thinking that the America in the West is Christian also was a big shock, especially to my mother, who was expecting more of that and being, oh, this is actually not really that Christian, is it? So things like that, I think were shocking to me. The way that I remember being in university and the way that people at a Christian university, people putting down Christianity as being intolerant, I thought was so weird. I thought, is Christianity really that intolerant when you can kind of write in the campus newspaper how intolerant Christianity is at a Christian newspaper and you're getting published? And how is this a real problem? You couldn't do this in the Middle East. You couldn't put Islam down it just, so things like that were pretty shocking. And I think that, meeting, something that my mom and I have talked about a lot is, you want to be able to, especially as a Christian and the values that Christian values, you want to be able to approach anybody on a human level first. You want to approach them as human to human. But the generational trauma and the background, we want to know their religion first. And I think that might surprise Westerners and Americans. Like, I'm not exactly sure how safe I am to talk to you until I know what your religion is. And you might be a perfectly wonderful, anything, whatever. But there is that paranoia first. Like, I want to know if you're a Christian or not before I can see how freely I can speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something I've encountered as well in the Middle East too, that also asking a question like, are you a Christian? Are you a Muslim? In these countries doesn't really tell you anything about their spiritual journey. It'll mean sometimes their family name, which can detail simply, oh, I'm from a Christian family. And it's a whole separate thing to say, well, do you believe this stuff? Are you an atheist? Do you go to church? Do you go to mass? Whatever the separate questions are. I think that's something that is a surprising thing that we encounter as well.
Yeah, we want to know the name to know the religion, to know if it's okay, right?
Yeah.
Even if we don't agree with that approach, it's there.
I can see that. So I'll turn now to Hadil and then to Andrew. So Hadil, very curious to hear about your experience growing up in Syria in this historic Christian region, the Nineveh Plain, which goes across the land borders of several of those countries. One of my first experiences in DC working in these types of issues was taking around a series of Christians from Syria who, when we were advocating for aid for the victims of ISIS, and learning in particular the story of this pastor from Damascus who was on the phone every few minutes in between meetings with senators, talking to his wife about where a bomb went off, how many people had left their church that week. At one point in between meetings, they had a mortar that actually lodged in their roof while he was on the phone. Didn't actually go off. It was a dud, thankfully. And then he just processed it, looked a little shaken, got off the phone and went to talk. I think it's just realities like that we can't really grasp. So I'd love to hear about your background, as well as being Christian in this country, in Syria, and then also coming to the West and seeing the contrasts of life in dhimmitude versus freedom here.
Yes, Isaac, thank you so much for having me and happy to be with Simone and Andrew today. So this is Hadil. I belong to a Syriac Orthodox community of Northeast Syria. It is one of the indigenous Christian communities in the Middle East. I was born and I grew up as a Syriac Orthodox Christian. We are the survivors of many massacres that my ancestors went through. We are originally from villages in southern Turkey. When the Armenian genocide took place against Armenians, many people are not familiar with what happened to my community, which is also another Christian community that was also targeted by the Kurdish and Ottomans and the tribes that committed the Armenian genocides. Many of my ancestors were killed. Those who were able to survive started to immigrate from southern Turkey to what is today northeast Syria. And it was a very hard journey. They ended up in an area that was totally desert in around 1920. There were no cities over there. And the Syriac Orthodox Christian community who came from southern Turkey to northeast Syria started to work hard and build those communities. And one of the biggest cities in northeast Syria today, as Kamishli, Hasake in northeast Syria. And by the way, this is the area where the U.S. has troops today in Syria. Is the area where our community came from and started to take as home for them after the massacres of 1920s, the Armenian genocide, and the massacres that took place against the Syriacs in the southern Turkey. I lived in northeast Syria until the age of 18. When I was 19, I traveled to Aleppo to study. It was my first year in college, and because I always did not want to live as a dhimmi, I did not want to be a second-class citizen who can't be involved in politics, who can't have an impact in their communities. I chose to be involved in politics. I chose to be involved in the uprising that started at the same year when I started the college. So after just a couple of months of me being a college student, we started to hear about the uprising in Tunisia. And I thought that we as Syrians, we deserve to live in democracy. We deserve to change the fate of our country, the government, and to live in a better community. Because as many people may know or not know, Syria is called the North Korea of the Middle East. We lived under the Ba'ath Party, the Assad regime, which is we lived under like big oppression, Christians, but also Muslims. The majority of the country was subjected to big oppression from the Assad regime, the Assad, the father, and then his son who inherited the presidency from his father. So I was involved in protesting in the streets in Syria with many other Syrian youth. Back then, the uprising was part of what was called the Arab Spring. I ended up being jailed by the Assad regime for protesting in Syria. I was released after 45 days of being kept in jail. And after that, I returned to my college, but I was very fearful, very worried about how life will look like after spending that time in jail, after the Syrian secret police started to know my name. And after the, unfortunately, the uprising that I believed in, I participated in it from the first days, started to turn into a civil war between Sunnis and Shia. The Assad regime, the government in Syria, is Alawite, a sect that's very close to Shia. So the Assad regime decided to make this alliance with Iran, the largest Shia country in the world, and the Iranian-backed militias started to pour into Syria to help the Assad regime to crack down on the uprising, which which at that time became a civil war between Islamist Sunni groups in the majority of it and Islamist Shia groups. And unfortunately, at this point, I started to see that I have no place in this conflict as a young student who wanted a moderate, secular government to rule Syria. I started to feel this pressure, political pressure, not only from the regime, not only from the Syrian regime and the government that jailed me, but unfortunately also from the opposition, the Syrian opposition, which started to be dominated by Islamist Sunni groups that are funded by other countries, powerful countries that wanted the Muslim Brotherhood, wanted the Islamist groups to win this war militarily and take over the Damascus from Assad. This did not happen, of course, because the world was worried from the alternative to the Syrian government, because as I was saying, how the uprising started to turn from a peaceful uprising, legitimate demands, to a civil war. The Western government, and especially here in Washington, D.C., President Barack Obama back then started to be also worried from the alternative. What will happen if we help the Syrian people to bring Assad down? Who is the alternative? And back then, everybody knew that there were many militias who are fighting Assad, who are against Assad, and who are ready to go and take over Syria if Assad fall. And these groups were very radical groups, and some of them ended up joining Al-Qaeda or evolving into ISIS, one of the worst radical groups that we knew back then. Before all these developments, I left Syria. I left Syria at the end of 2011. I stayed in Geneva briefly, and then I came to the United States with the help of the U.S. Embassy in Switzerland.
So thank you so much, Hadil. If I could ask one really hard question, there might not be a great answer to, but it recalls the conversation I had with this pastor I was mentioning. I think Christians are caught in such a hard place in Syria, and before that in Iraq under the Baathists, these secular, socialist, dictatorial parties, which at the very least from a Christian perspective don't typically have genocide of Christians in their charters, but they're equal opportunity, essentially, anybody that falls afoul of the regime. And it must have been so difficult to face that shift when you saw what you hope would manifest as freedom and liberation shifting towards prevailing attitudes in the country, which were more Islamist. So I wonder, how did you think about this, and how do Christians there think about who to support, who to back, what a moral choice would be when you face clear oppression under a secular dictator, or essentially secular, versus more representative government that could, mean the extinction of Christians in that area?
Yes, that's a great question, Isaac, because I was one of very few Christians in Syria who chose to participate in the uprising against Assad, because the Christians in Syria, and not only in Syria, in the entire region, maybe except for Lebanon, because in Lebanon they were always influential and they were always strong and has an impact in politics. I was one of few Syrians who supported the uprising and supported the change in Syria. Christians in the region tend to support the status quo, even if it's very bad, because you started by talking about dhimmism, and many people don't know that part of the dhimmi rule included that Christians, our ancestors, were not allowed to bear an arm, and arms back then were swords. So our ancestors did not know how to defend themselves. And this is something that the younger generation, of course, inherited. We could not ride a horse, and that was it makes you powerful. So this is why our community did not tend to support any big change that will require them to defend themselves, that will require them to endure hardship or hard situations in conflicts. This is why most of the Syrians were saying to themselves, let's stay with Assad. What we know is better than what we don't know, and not support this change. And many of the people that I know, including some of my relatives, later on, they started to tell me, see, you supported the Al-Qaeda and ISIS, these radical groups who pretended to be a civilian movement in an opposition, and now you are against them. You understand that these are radical people. But I think that was a few years ago. But right now, the Christian community of Syria, who unfortunately ended up in Sweden, Germany, here in the US as immigrants, or in the other scenarios in the neighboring countries like Erbil in Kurdistan, Iraq, they know that the survival of Assad did not even help them, because the survival of Assad today means a collapsed country. A collapsed country, that means thugs are in the streets. That means a collapsed economy, a very horrible situation that's making it impossible for the Christians to stay in Syria. So they know now that the status quo was that they preferred was not the ideal option. Of course, the other option was not ideal as well. What was the solution that was going to put the Christians in a better position today? I think was a better international involvement in the Syrian issue, some help from the international community, mainly from Washington, to shape a good alternative to Assad that's not the Islamists, and that's not keeping Assad in power while sanctioning Syria and just forgetting about it. Because the horrible situation in Syria today is not only bad for the indigenous Christians of Syria, it's bad for the neighboring Israel, who is now enduring a very challenging war with Gaza, while having also a delayed issue on its borders with Syria and Lebanon. Of course, there are clashes now between Israel and the Iran-backed militias in Syria and Lebanon. But what happened today in Syria, because of like we kept this issue open. We didn't deal with Syria, with the war in Syria. And what happened because of Assad's survival is that Assad was very much weakened, that he has to rely on Iran to stay in power. And that led to the growth of the Iranian power in Syria, which is very dangerous today for the security of Israel, very dangerous for Lebanon, for a very important partner like Jordan. Now the borders between Syria and Jordan are becoming a very dangerous route for drug smuggling, as Syria turned into one of the most well-known Captagon and other drugs manufacturing bases. So there are a lot of bad things that are happening today in Syria, and that are having a very bad impact on the neighboring countries and on the US national interests, because we did not deal with the Syrian issue in a better way.
Thanks, Hadil. I'm going to turn to Andrew now, and feel free to take it different directions you'd like based on your experience. For those of you that don't know Andrew Doran, I look forward to the memoir that might be released someday of his travels and experiences, both inside and outside of government. But I know you've seen war zones, you've seen the conflict of Muslims and Christians from places like the Balkans to across the Middle East. And now turning to the article you wrote recently, I'm curious what motivated it, and then also specifically on the case of Israel. Could you maybe paint this distinction that we see for life of Christians and even Muslim minorities in this majority Jewish state? I think it serves as a microcosm and a very readily available set of choices for anyone who wants to look at this region. We can speculate about a lot of solutions, but I think just take a magnifying glass and look at Israel and the situation of different religious minorities. I think we can see some paths forward. So just wanted to turn to that to address the article.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much, Isaac. I think my earliest experience with this firsthand was in Bosnia-Herzegovina in the mid-90s with the U.S. military, and of course any person visiting Southeastern Europe becomes aware of the history of the Ottomans in that part of Europe. They extended that far, and so much of what we're talking about now goes back to the Turks and not merely their extension into Europe, their conquest of Anatolia 1,000 years ago. We were talking at the outset about Armenia, and I think, returning to this question of dimitude, you can think of a kind of spectrum where you have dhimmi in the Middle East who are denied horses, swords, any sort of political representation. You see exceptions to that, of course, in places like Mount Lebanon, but you have this sense of a Christian being kind of beaten down in a way that, for Westerners, we would think of medieval and even modern Jewish minorities across Europe suffering a kind of second-class citizenship. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have Armenia in 1918 fighting for its independence against really all odds, carving out, reforging a nation in the modern era. Israel doing something very similar, following a genocide also 30 years later. And this really, I think, forces the outsider to look at this and say, you either have abject humiliation or you have nationhood or some sort of political community that you have to forge in order to survive. And if you look at the history of Southeastern Europe, which in the aftermath of the 17th century, the forging of nation states becomes something that's very, it's almost second nature to us in the West. It's very alien to the Middle East. So to come back to the article, I think as an American who took a great deal of interest in the subject, certainly after 2001, when America became engaged in a very assertive way in the Middle East, it became clear, I think, fairly early on, and I think would be clear to Hadil, certainly to Simone and her family and people from a Middle Eastern background. When Americans went into the Middle East, they didn't really understand what it was that they were trying to build, I think. And so when I would travel the Middle East, or I hope anywhere, you want to ask a lot of questions, travel, listen, try to understand. And after a while, you start to distill what are the handful of things that are so different, so radically different from American culture, where we speak one language, which is also, for better or for worse, the global lingua franca. We're a very high trust society. We're a very pluralistic society. We are the opposite of a low trust tribal society. We're also intensely idealistic in a lot of ways, and all of these things failed to serve us well, I think, in the Middle East. And one of the things that stood out that Americans just would not be able to understand, because it's so alien to us, with our very rigid sense of equality, with the kind of innate egalitarianism that we bring. And you leave Americans alone talking about any abstract political idea, and they will inevitably start talking about the common good. That's not a universal phenomenon in the world. This is something that we get from it's what Adam Garfinkel calls the religion of enlightened universalism, and I think he's correct about that. To put it more crudely, we see in everyone around the world Americans fighting to get out, and sometimes there's truth in that. Sometimes we see idealists, principled people like Hadil, who understood here is an opportunity, but the people who had seen these sorts of things come and go were a little bit more cynical, jaded. They weren't willing to throw in, and it's impossible, of course, to look back and say that either side was right or wrong. We only know what happened. And in the process that she's describing, from 2011 to 2015, when the US did a lot of clandestine backing, we backed a lot of the wrong horses on the ground. And we turned our backs on the very people from Hadil's community we should have been betting on, and bet on the wrong horses. And that wasn't really clearly understood. And a lot of that had to do with American naivete. As someone said, we meant well. But the question of dimitude was one of the things that stood out. Low social trust, the absence of democratic institutions. There were many things that might stand out. Tribalism is something that simply doesn't make sense, for the most part, to Americans. It's very counterintuitive. It's not something we understand. We're baffled when we look at things like the consanguineous marriage rates from the Gulf to Afghanistan to Mesopotamia, North Africa. It's something that is a common feature in tribal societies and makes the building of impersonal democratic institutions extremely difficult. But the institutionalization of something like dimitude, it did exist in medieval Europe. I think it was the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 that kind of solidified it socially across Europe. What had been habitual in a lot of places, things like wearing the star for Muslims and Jews in Europe. That was something that had existed across the predominantly Muslim world or at least the Muslim governing part of the world for centuries already. So yeah, dimitude is something that is not intuitive. And I think on the one hand, you travel to places and you try to understand, you try to learn, listen, seek out patterns and try to explain it to your fellow Americans back home. What are the things that as you come to understand that you can hope to explain that are intensely complicated? But since October 7th, for example, how many of us have friends who have extremely strong opinions about these parts of the world that they've never been to? And as outsiders, naturally, you tread very humbly onto this ground. But at the same time, America is a military superpower. We have had a very strong presence in the region. There are a lot of very powerful interest groups in Washington, foreign lobbies, all sorts of people running around with an agenda that's either backed by money or ideology or some notion of self-interest. It's very hard for your voice to be heard. So when you're swimming against the current, so to speak, as I was in 2012, 13, 14, writing about how there were Al-Qaeda linked, ideologically affiliated extremist groups in Syria that had really begun by then to seize control of that revolution and turned it into a kind of civil war, whatever else one wanted to call it. There was a lot of resistance in Washington. I mean, there's a lot of fury that gets thrown your way, and that sort of thing. So, but dimitude is one of those things that certainly leapt out. And so you notice it when you see it. And you notice it when you see Armenian, Syriac, Maronite Christians around the region who refuse to be dhimmi. And there is a pattern of seeking out geographic space. So often over the last 25 years, you hear Americans say, oh, well, all we need to do is just ensure that there's equal citizenship in Iraq. Oh, well, it's that easy, is it? Okay. I mean, I'm not kidding. You would hear people talk about this in a serious way. So I think we've certainly been humbled in the region, but we have so much more to learn. And I just think it's so many of these things are so counterintuitive. So I wanted to write about that because I see certainly your heart breaks for anyone in the situation of Christians in Gaza, but to see a small community like that manipulated and used, and then to see even Catholic institutions knowing what's going on, jumping on top of that and saying, see, the Israelis are terrible. Yeah, it's a pretty frustrating to see some of the institutions that made the dimitude of Jews in Europe something that was first de facto and then de jure, also a source of profound frustration. So I don't have a lot of patience for it as a Christian. I can't imagine how I would feel if I were Jewish, or and a number of Christians certainly look at that with the same sense of pity
Yeah.
and compassion, but um, also somewhat infuriated because that's just another indicator of Dimude.
Yeah, so I'll leave this open for you guys to respond, but just some thoughts that came while you were speaking. I think it's interesting on our trips we do to Israel because we frequently go across the lines into the West Bank or Judea and Samaria, depending on who you refer to, who is referring to it. Sometimes we'll go close to the border of Gaza, and so we can see typically within a span of a few days this clash of cultures, or honestly, most of the time you don't really experience a clash, but at least contrasts when you go across these checkpoints. And in the opening of the article there, you described a meeting we had a few years ago where I'll give my own color to it, but remember that particular day, so that for those that didn't read the article, Andrew referred to a meeting we had with a Arab sheikh in the West Bank who was describing or basically answering a question about the status of Christians, which is something we tried to pin down a lot of Muslims while we were traveling, essentially debating the two-state solution. A very relevant question that I think Christians should have is what religious freedom would both Jews and Christians enjoy, if any at all, under Muslim rule, which is what a Palestinian state would be. And we typically get very evasive answers, but this gentleman, which is a overly generous term to use for him, basically answered the question about the status of Christians to say they are our guests. He basically said, they love us. Every time I'm out on the street, they come and they shake my hand. They show up to our weddings. They bring gifts for my daughter when she got married. We didn't even invite her. This is, how she painted it. And it was essentially right out of The Godfather, this idea of a mafia don lording over power and then taking the subservience that he witnesses as some kind of right or moral right that, the status is enjoyed. And I contrasted that with things I saw in Israel. One of my trips in 2017, when it was still in the thick of the fight against ISIS, involved a trip to a hospital in northern Israel, very close to the border of Syria. And we went to visit several young men who were injured in the hospital. These were men from Syria. Typically, we had no idea exactly their point of origin. As a matter of safety or strategy, for whatever reason, when these injured people would come to the border of Israel, they would typically throw all their identification away. We have no idea who they were, where they were from. They were all military-age males, likely of Muslim background, but Israel knew nothing about them aside from the fact that they were injured. Some people were missing limbs, some people were injured and would give a variety of stories accounting for their injuries, like motorcycle accidents, various kind of things. Nobody ever mentioned direct contact with fighting, but Israel basically on the honor system took their word, let these men who very, very reasonably could pose a security threat to the state of Israel come in, be supervised, be cared for, be tended. I just remember sitting in this hospital room looking across at this and trying to contrast, would any of the countries surrounding Israel or very much of the Muslim world treat Israelis, either Christian or Jewish, in a similar fashion? There was no PR gain. I'd never heard of this practice until I was there. It's just something that Israel did quietly without any fanfare. I think it's important to think about that. After October 7th, we've heard a lot of criticism about the treatment of civilians or what military measures are justified, boots on the ground versus airstrikes. And I think it's all legitimate for us as allies or other people involved to ask questions and pose, moral clarity on the issue. But I think the posture of the two sides we're talking about is something that's often lost. You have the stated value system and the vast majority of the pattern of behavior of Israel, which has close to 2 million non-Jewish citizens that enjoy rights, enjoy protection, enjoy religious freedom. And then you contrast that with the stated genocidal intent of Hamas and then their demonstrated actions. And to get the same amount of moral fervor up about an atrocity committed on this side by Hamas versus abuses which might occur and are typically taken to court and remedied on the Israeli side just seems to me to be losing the moral plot. And I think so many people that haven't studied this more closely just feel this moral need to take the affinity we feel with Israel as kind of a Judeo-Christian state closer to the West, and therefore hold it to this higher standard and critique it to basically show the rest of the world that we're not playing favorites. We're not showing nepotism of our cousins. But I think this is just a time where it's radically out of step with what we're actually called to do. And I don't see it doing any good to the plight of civilians on either side. So I'm curious about reactions from those of you on the panel to that.
One thing I would say quickly is that when you have low standards and you have outside forces who, media, academia, observers who are weighing in, and this is true of really almost any context, especially in that part of the world. You're going to incentivize bad behavior, and we, the West, mainly civil society institutions, have done this, and it really is. It doesn't make anything better for anyone in that part of the world. There was a question about whether or not Israel is beyond criticism. Of course not. Israel's not beyond criticism at all, and where there's wrongdoing, there should be criticism. But I don't think I've ever seen the Israelis rejected plans for that our government, the U.S. government, gave to the Israelis to model, to use our Raqqa Mosul military plans to basically replicate that plan in Gaza, where there were very high casualties. There were a number of hostages on the ground. Many elements of it were comparable. And the Israelis said, no, we're going to go in on the ground with more troops, and they've suffered higher casualties as a result. Can we agree that the criticism of the U.S. government and its allies and partners in the anti-ISIL coalition have received a tiny fraction of the criticism Israel has gotten for utilizing a much more humane plan in Gaza? And there's no sense that Hamas or anyone who supports them bears any of the moral responsibility here, any of the weight. It's all to be borne by Israel. I'm not saying Israel's perfect, but I think I just need I need to hear more people who are critical of Israel also be critical of Hamas, its supporters. And the fact that they're not critical incentivizes Hamas to do things like hold Christians hostage in a church, instead of being outraged that these Christians are not permitted to leave this church in Gaza. The fury is aimed at Israel. So this isn't about a defense of Israel. This is about a defense of Christians. So yeah, I'm a little bit sickened by all the sycophantic people who want to blame Israel for everything without taking any moral responsibility. It's disgusting.
I want to add one thing here also regarding the Christians of Gaza. We always it takes the headlines, and we hear a lot in the news these days that Israel is targeting churches inside Gaza. The Christians are having a bad impact from this war, from the Israeli strikes. But nobody asks why the numbers of the Christians in Gaza have dwindled in a very horrific way, although they were not under the control of Israel. They were under the control of Hamas. And despite of that, they preferred to leave the country, and their numbers went from hundreds of thousands to a couple of hundreds, or like a little bit around 1,000 Christians remained in Gaza, and no one is giving it the time or the effort to see why the Christians did not want to stay under the control of Hamas. And there is big suffering. It's horrible. It's impossible to live as a Christian family, especially with younger kids, having kids who will go to college, wants to live their normal life. It's impossible to live under Hamas. And unfortunately, also the numbers of the Christians in the West Bank under the Palestinian authorities, many of them prefer to leave the country and prefer to immigrate rather than staying under the chaotic situation under the PA. So these are legitimate questions that we should ask. The situation of the Christians of Gaza and the West Bank is horrible, not because of Israel. The Christianity in the heart of where the Christianity came from is ending, not because of Israel, but because of the Islamist groups like Hamas and their behavior.
Yes, Simone, I think you had a thought as well.
Well, I don't know if it's exactly related to the thread that Andrew and Hadil are on, but I think I'm trying to read the questions from the attendees while paying attention to our panelists. And there's this like, well, shouldn't we, is it okay to criticize? And I think Andrew addressed that very well in Hadil's point about why are Christians leaving in the first place is there. So I think that kind of speaks to like the idealism that Andrew was referring to in terms of like a Western idealism, and something that, again, from a Middle Eastern context, it's lovely to have theories and ideals and shoot for the moon and all of that, but there's like certain geopolitical realities that we have to exist under. And so if you're going to, quote, take a side, which side do you prefer? And I think that's, again, the question of like, well, at lowest common denominator, are we just supposed to be a little bit better than, the enemy, so to speak? But if your choice is a better or worse kind of thing, maybe it's not ideal, but it's a lot better than the alternative, you're going to go with that. You're going to go with that. And, being dhimmi in the Middle East, being a second-class citizen, knowing that you're never going to be number one in your class, you're going to get beat up on the streets. I mean, my Coptic friends have told me story upon stories of growing up in Egypt as Copts, because our story is a little bit different, being Armenian Egyptians, and very frequent in the streets being beat up and being called Coptic slurs that have been slurs since the 9th and 10th centuries. Right. So in the West, we're very, very disconnected from history. We don't even know it. But this is a people in a land that history is now. And so to be the subject of discrimination and persecution to the point of certain slurs that have been literally used for centuries, I think is totally outside of the existential psyche of the West.
Yeah, and one just point that I would add on top of that, as I see a lot of the criticism coming in, and I have been critical of Israel. I've had pretty candid conversations with Israeli officials at times about things I'm troubled by, and that's as an American visiting. But I do think there is, and this is another one of those things, we've been talking about things that aren't really understood in the Middle East by Westerners. One thing that I think Westerners don't understand themselves, that they share with a lot of people around the world, is a profound discomfort with Jewish power. Anything that is Jewish majority power simply makes people, for whatever reason, very uncomfortable. And I think if I, however imperfectly, Israel may, which has a very difficult task, however imperfectly it may take care of its minorities or protect religious freedom, it does it better than any of its neighbors that I've seen. The only thing that might have been in play for a long time would be Lebanon, where you had religious pluralism and religious freedom, and still have it to some extent today, but that's waning because of Iran. And so, yeah, I don't know what else to say, except I think it's very clear. Like, the point I think that we've all tried to make is, if you're only being critical of Israel, you're not doing Christians in the region any favors.
Yeah, I think that about brings us to time. One final point I'll make, just to emphasize that criticism is legitimate, and holding people to a moral account is, but I would challenge anyone who thinks Israel's not wrestling with these moral quandaries to actually talk to Israelis. We know people, many who have been serving in the IDF. Some of our alumni have gone on trips with guides who also served in the IDF. Several of these people in the weeks after October 7th had so many dead friends and relatives that they had to pick which funerals to go to, because so many were happening simultaneous, which families to comfort. Just 2 weeks ago, I was with a colleague from Israel who was sharing how a kid, now he's not a kid anymore, but someone he coached growing up in his local community, was serving the IDF, was in Gaza, and they reached one of these moral quandaries. There was a house that they had to go into, and there was a debate about calling for a strike or going in on foot. They ended up deciding to try to go in on foot. They were unsure about civilians. It was too ambiguous. This kid in his early 20s volunteered, popped up his head, was the first one to go out, and immediately was killed by a sniper bullet for making that choice. They eventually achieved their objective with even more casualties, but there are countless stories like that where given the choice between trying to preserve the life of even the person next to you, someone you know and care about and love, versus someone who is theoretical and abstract, but you know is created in the image of God, might be an innocent civilian, and therefore deserves some degree of protection too. These choices are made every single day in many ways we don't know. So if you think this is not a burden that Israel and its citizens are wrestling with, I would just say, expand your experience, talk to more people. It doesn't mean abuses don't happen, but there is the preponderance of the moral spirit of the state of Israel that I think we've witnessed. And that's something that is the best hope that Middle Eastern Christians have, that even Muslims in the Middle East have. And I just encourage everyone to pray for our brothers and sisters over there, and then for a successful end to this conflict with a lasting peace. So thank you all for joining us, and we hope you'll stay tuned for future content we have. Have a great day.